Do we need the Department of Education? It's one of the areas of the federal government that the Trump administration would like to, in Elon Musk's memorable words, feed into the wood chipper. And dismantling the Department of Education has been on the to-do list for many Republicans since shortly after it was created way back in 1979 by the Carter administration. Now, to be clear, the department is not in charge of funding your local schools. In fact, more than 90% of public schools K through 12 are funded by state and local taxes, not the federal government. But the Department of Education does have an $80 billion budget, and its mission sure sounds important on paper. Tracking overall student achievement, financial assistance to low-income schools, managing federal student loans, and enforcing laws on civil rights and disabilities. So the big questions are, is the department accomplishing those goals? And what would happen if it were gone? To help us with that, we are joined by Margaret Spellings, who served as the Secretary of Education under the Bush administration and is the president of and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Margaret, very good to have you here. Few people would be better suited to address these questions than you. I think a lot of people are just confused about what the Department of Education at the federal level does. What would you say the mission is?
The Department of Education was founded because we have a shared American belief that education is the way to find the American dream, to prosperity for individuals and our country. And that too often, educational opportunity has been determined by zip code or a lack of resources. And so our thesis for many decades has been that it was right for us to support students across the country on the K-12 side of the house to meet this shared objective of a quality education.
So, Margaret, it's an admirable goal. I don't know anyone who would be against it. How well has that goal been accomplished by the department, and why do it at the federal level as opposed to let the states and local governments take care of it?
One of the most important things the federal government does is really provide a reckoning of how states are doing. So our nation's education report card that came out just a couple of weeks ago really raised some very serious red flags. Without that kind of data, we don't know, who's winning and who's losing, where we need to course correct and so forth. So that oversight, this idea that education as a civil right, the enforcement mechanisms that come around that with respect to low-income and minority students and special ed students in particular, that is a proper role of the federal government. You know, as you said in the opening, most of the resources come from states and locals, and they are the ones that set curriculum standards, describe reading lists and books, that really drive education policy in our country, and there are express prohibitions at the federal level for intervening in that.
So, Margaret, we've already seen hundreds of millions of dollars cut into the Department of Education. The president has said he wants to close it down. What would be the impact on students, on children, if that does happen?
One of the most worrisome things I saw early was this elimination or drastic cuts to the part of the Department of Education that does research around what's working and what isn't. You know, we also have to keep in mind that the number one priority for our country is to make sure that students are performing in reading and math, in particular on grade level throughout their schooling. And so without that research, without that accountability, without that transparency, we're really flying blind in a time when education is the coin of the realm.
You know, Margaret, the criticism I often hear from Republicans is that that public education, which is supposed to create good citizens in a democracy, you need an educated population, instead is stamping out good Democrats to vote for Democrats going forward. Is there a bias that's introduced into education that comes from the federal level?
Well, I think at the federal level, not so much. Is there bias that comes in the way of curriculum and reading lists and those sorts of things that are prescribed at the state and local level? That's possible. And so people should engage with their school boards, with their state legislatures, and go do that work. But, on the margin, maybe certainly in the Biden administration, we saw guidance letters and policies around women, around Title IX and sports and the rights of transgender students and so forth. And so, to the extent that this administration is focused on that, you'll see some change. But for the most part, the frustration that Americans rightly have with our schools ought to be pointed at state legislatures and local school boards and not in Washington. Washington is there to provide oversight, resources to level the playing field so that students around our country have opportunity.
Yeah, very clear. Margaret Spellings, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.